Working with numbers and dates are very common scenarios in programming, and in this chapter, we're going to look at some of the ways that .NET makes this much easier. We're going to start by looking at how to use .NET to parse numbers from strings. And I'm sure you can imagine that there are lots of different scenarios where this kind of conversion needs to be performed, such as when the user enters a string of data into a form or some other type of user input. So here in my VS Code editor, in the parse numbers folder in the start folder, I'm going to open up my code. And here in my code for this exercise, I have an array of strings that represent different number types, right? So I have an integer, some floating points, right? I've got a scientific notation number here. And you can see that some of them have a white space in the strings, right? So there's some spaces here and so on. So each of the basic data types in .NET has a parse method associated with it, which can be used to take a string and convert it into that data type. So what we're going to do is use this for loop to try and parse each of these numbers. The parse method throws an exception if it's unable to parse the string, so we need to enclose it in a try catch block. So I'll write my try code here, and inside the try, I'll use my test float variable, which I have right here, and I'm going to write float.parse. And it's going to take the string. All right. So we're going to loop over each string in this array, and we're going to try to parse each one of these. So we'll try to parse it as a float, and then we will write that out. And once again, I'm going to use my string interpolation to do this. So I'll write that the parsed number is, all right, test float. And then we'll do the same thing with test int. And I'll do int.parse on this one. And we'll take the string. And once again, we will write it out that the parsed number is, in this case, it's going to be test int. And then, of course, I need to catch any exception that happens. So I'll put my catch block in here. And if the number can't be parsed, it's going to throw a format exception. And I'll just simply write out that we could not parse the string, whatever the string was, and we'll print out whatever the exception message is. So let's go ahead and run what we have. So let's open this up in the terminal, and we will .NET run this. And you can see that each of the numbers can be successfully parsed as in a float, but not as an integer, right? So the 1 worked in both cases. The 1.5 is a floating point number, but could not parse this as an integer, right? 100 is clearly an integer. And then the 5e plus 04 scientific notation could be parsed as a float, but it could not be parsed as an integer. Now, sometimes you don't care what the exception is, and having to catch exceptions all the time can be a bit cumbersome. So there's also a simpler try parse method, which just returns a Boolean true or false based upon whether the parse succeeds or fails. So let's go ahead and close this. And let's try the try parse method. So what I'm going to do is I have a Boolean variable here named result. And what I'll do is write result, and I'll assign that to the result of the try parse method. Now this doesn't throw an exception, it just simply returns true or false. So I'll try parsing numsters, and we'll start with 0. Now, because the try parse method returns a Boolean, I have to use a C# out variable to get the result back. All right. So in this case, the return of the function is going to be in this parameter right here. And then I'll just simply write out whether or not this failed, and I'll write result. And then inside single quotes, I'll put numsters sub 0 and a little colon, and then the result, which will be in test int. And then I'll just do this a few times. So I'll copy this and we'll paste it. And this time we'll do numsters 1. And what we'll do now is we'll try to parse the float instead. So this will be test float. And that means this will be test float as well. And that will also be numsters 1. And then let's paste this a couple more times. All right, so we'll do numsters 2 and 3. And in this case, this will be an integer again. And then the last one will also be a float. So I'll just copy and paste test float there. And that's going to be a float parse. So we'll change that to float. All right. So now we have code that's going to use try parse for each one of the numbers in this array rather than trying to catch exceptions. And let's go ahead and comment out the previous exercise so we don't have to worry about seeing it. Let's do a control/ there that comments out the code. So now we have just our last example here. So let's go ahead and run this again. Let's open up this in our terminal. And let's run this. And sure enough, you can see that they all succeed, right? So we were able to parse the integers and we were able to parse the floats. So let's try changing one to a situation that we know is going to fail, right? Like the first integer one. So let's go ahead and try and parse the first integer, or let's see, actually, where is it? It's not the first integer, it's the 1.45. So let's try to parse the 1.45 number as an int. All right. Now we know that's going to fail. So let's go ahead and run this again. And sure enough, you can see that now the result is false for a try parse when we try to parse this floating point number as an integer. So by using the parse and try parse methods, you can easily convert string data into basic built-in data types.